In our occupational therapy work with individuals, there can sometimes be a feeling of futility, especially as there is a growing societal level consciousness around what we as OT professionals already experience day in and day out, that the communities in which we live have a profound impact on our health. And we can fail individuals by focusing only on their individual choices and not on these larger driving forces in their lives. I think this expanding view of health is why we are seeing such a surge of interest in OT community practice from students, new grads, and tired clinicians. Community practice actually has a long history in occupational therapy, but very few clinicians find full-time work in this practice area today. According to the authors of this week's featured article, this may be due to a lack of frameworks for community-based OT. So today we'll explore the framework that the authors put forth and their call to reimagine occupational therapy clients as communities. After we review this article, we will welcome to the podcast Ryan Lavalley, PhD OTRL. He will help us unpack this topic. Dr. Lavalley is the founder and primary lead of the Community Practice Lab at UNC School of Medicine. So let's dive in. Welcome to the OT Potential Podcast, where we review new and influential OT journal articles, then invite on an expert guest to help us pull out actionable takeaways that you can implement in your practice starting today. Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Lyon, and I am a licensed occupational therapist. Before we dive into this topic of community-based OT, I wanted to let you know that this podcast may qualify as continuing education for you. You are probably listening to this podcast on a free podcast platform, but to gain CEU credit, you will need to be a member of the OT Potential Club, our OT continuing education platform. Bearing in mind that this could count as a CEU course, I wanted to state our 2 learning objectives so you can be thinking about them throughout the podcast today. Our first learning objective is you will be able to identify the intervention tools that OTs can utilize with individuals and communities. And second, you will be able to recognize how outcomes differ in OT community practice from individual practice. So let's begin by looking at this journal article, and then we will bring on Ryan to discuss how this article could play out in your practice. The article we are reviewing today is called Reimagining Occupational Therapy Clients as Communities, presenting the community-centered practice framework. This article comes to us from the Scandinavian Journal of Occupational Therapy, and it was published in 2019. So while OT professionals are commonly viewed as person-centered, individually focused providers, the authors of this article argue that OT professionals have worked in community-based settings and contributed to community practice for over 100 years. But despite this long history, our work with community remains limited today. In fact, as I was looking at this topic, I explored the 2023 AOTA Workforce Survey, and 0.7% of respondents reported working in community-based private practice, and only 0.4% said they worked in community mental health and behavioral settings. So given that this is a pretty small practice area, why is there this focus on community practice now? The authors argue that in light of an increased emphasis on community practice expansion in government-driven health policy, there is a need for increased support of community practice OT. Case in point, I'll link to a guide on community-centered approaches from Public Health England, which advocates for improved uptake of community-centered interventions to strengthen and build community, create and support volunteer and peer communities, involve collaborations and partnerships, and enable access to community resources. So we already have a small portion of OTs working in community practice. There is just this global and societal level recognition of the need for more community practice, which leads us to this question of what has already been written about community practice OT in the research. As occupational therapy professionals, we already have a solid foundation for stepping into community work and meeting the rising demand for community-based practice. The authors highlight 3 strengths that we bring to this area. First, occupational therapy's work with communities is well established in our overarching practice frameworks. For example, the World Federation of OT defines occupational therapy clients as both people and communities. Second, past research also demonstrates the breadth of community-based occupational therapy practice, including our involvement with health and policy in Indigenous communities, urban planning projects and environmental design of age-friendly communities, environmental sustainability, and natural disaster preparedness. And third, they point to that just our training and our occupational therapy education equips us with the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are valuable to community clients. But even with this background, the authors posit that knowledge gaps in literature, including a lack of a framework for community-centered practice, are likely to hold OTs back from confidently pursuing this practice area, which leads us into the heart of this paper. So what was the intent of this article? The intent of this article is to present a conceptual framework for community-centered practice in OT. What were their methods to do this? Well, to develop their conceptual framework, the authors selected 2 cases for cross-analysis of themes. To be included in this analysis, the cases had to be located in a Western high-income developed country, English-speaking, identified as an exemplar of community participation, and located somewhere accessible for fieldwork for these authors to actually go visit. 2 cases were chosen for analysis, and please note these are not occupational therapy specific cases. The first was a network of Canadian food security programs, and the second was a rural Australian banking initiative. The researchers visited both sites and performed semi-structured interviews, observation, and document analysis. In the article, they go into detail on both cases and their analysis, but for the sake of this review, I am going to focus on the framework that was developed as a result. So looking at this community practice framework, the developed framework has 4 components, each with guiding questions for the occupational therapy professional. I definitely encourage you to look at this visual of this framework. In our show notes, you'll see 4 boxes that kind of all lead into each other. I'll go through these 4 boxes one by one and highlight the questions that come along with each of these boxes. So the first box starts with community identity. In this section, the OT professional is prompted to consider who is the community client. 2 primary considerations they encourage OTs to think about at this stage are who are the social actors, including individuals, groups, organizations, and networks, and what is the makeup of the social field. A community's social field includes the diverse range of clients who move in and out and through the social space. The second consideration in this first box is what factors related to the place setting should also be considered, for example, in the natural and built environment. Place attachment may be a helpful theory to consider. So that's community identity. Heading into the second box, this is community occupations. In this section, the OT professional is prompted to consider what occupations are important and what is the occupational therapy goal. 2 potentially useful considerations for thinking about these are what co-occupations or collective occupations are being performed. And second, given the heterogeneity of communities, how is community diversity being explored and understood? So now we have community identity and community occupations, and we head into that third box of community resources and barriers. In this section, the OT professional is prompted to consider what resources are needed by the community and what barriers prevent participation. Occupational therapy professionals are encouraged to consider both economic and non-economic resources as well as power distribution. And the fourth box is participation enablement. In this section, the OT professional is prompted to consider what processes are being used for community participation and what is the occupational therapist's role in enablement. This participation enablement to me just really felt like the heart of what OTs can provide, and they provide multiple considerations in this section. When examining the process being used for participation, the authors encourage us to consider Pretty's typology of participation. There are 7 stages to this. which I'm actually just going to read through these because I think this was helpful to think about in any OT setting. And you'll hear in these 7 stages, there is this progression to, I guess, a higher level of participation. It begins with 1, manipulative participation, 2, passive participation, 3, participation by consultation, 4, participation for material incentives, 5, functional participation, 6, interactive participation, and 7, self-mobilization. So that helps us wrap our mind around the type of participation that is being considered, both where the community currently is and where they want to go. Specific community enablement strategies that could be considered include providing leadership development, leveraging partnerships and capacity building, facilitating online participation via social media, and employing multi-method strategies that are socially and culturally diverse. So that wraps up our overview of this community practice framework. Again, there's these 4 sections. I encourage you to look at the visual because that helped me a lot. Heading into the conclusion, the authors encourage OT professionals and students to trial this framework. Future research is needed to trial and evaluate the framework, with the goal of ensuring that OT practice with communities is informed by a robust evidence base. Okay, that wraps up our review of this article. I was thankful to this paper to get my mind turning on how community practice is similar and distinct from individual practice, but also left with a lot of questions, in particular, what these jobs can look like and what exactly OT's role can look like just on the day-to-day. And I am so thankful to welcome to the podcast Ryan Lavalley, PhD OTRL. Ryan is going to help sharpen our thinking on this, but also make it feel more actionable and concrete for us. As a background, Ryan is an assistant professor of occupational therapy and occupational science and the primary lead for the community practice lab in the Department of Health Sciences at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill School of Medicine. Dr. Lavalley has nearly 10 years of experience in community practice. And broadly, his practice and research sits at the intersections of aging, housing, and anti-oppression. In community, he has experience conducting qualitative research, community program development, coalition building, and program evaluation in partnership with multiple community organizations, including nonprofits, local governments, and community institutions. And just as a personal disclosure, I do want to let you know that I really value Ryan's insight into communities, and he does sit on our advisory board for the OT Potential Club and receives a small stipend for this work. So without further ado, I will patch Ryan into this podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Ryan. It's great to have you.
It's good to be here. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
I am so thankful you are here. I for so long have been sold on the importance of community in our health, like to just focus on the individual. We just see how much we miss by just looking at that level. And I just see in our world and in my own life how much our communities impact our individual health. So I hypothetically see the role for OT there, but I've struggled to make that concrete in my mind. Like, what are these jobs? What do these OTs do? And I enjoyed the theoretical, like reading about the theory of this in the paper, but I'm thankful that you're here to help make it even more concrete for us. So I'm excited to get to all of that, but I want to start with you and your story and just how did you become interested in this practice area in OT and community practice?
Yeah, so I came into occupational therapy really thinking about biology and psychology, sort of a fairly typical way people find the profession, and wanting to be able to engage with people, but also recognize their context and the mind and the body, and not just look at it as a machine. But at the same time, I was actually at a Jesuit institution, Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. And part of that sort of culture was really thinking about structural injustice and thinking about communities. And so during my time as an undergraduate, I worked a lot with the unhoused population. And part of that wasn't specifically intervention oriented. I was just hanging out with people on the streets and really learning to be with them and build relationship with them. And I would ended up also leading groups of students sort of into the city, and where we got to meet people, spent time with people, ate food with people. And through that, like doing together, I sort of started realizing there was a lot more to homelessness and sort of poverty than just this individual choice to be on the streets or some sort of moral failing to be on the streets. Like we were taught these sorts of ideals within our society. And then I would say the big break point, I actually went to Nicaragua for a semester as part of my undergraduate program before going into the master's program. And learning about the history of the United States, learning about Nicaraguan history and different cultural differences that really revealed to me sort of this bigger context that we needed to understand both occupation and human doing. And so being able to see those moments both in Nicaragua and on the streets of Cincinnati where everyday doing was the medium through which things changed by building relationships with people who are living under an underpass and just hanging out with them, painting, eating. We saw shifts in both the students who were engaging in their understanding of social issues, but also the way that people understood themselves as humans who deserve to do things. And so building those relationships actually then almost unintentionally led a lot of people that we were working with to actually start looking for housing or get connected to other resources within the community, just simply through conversations that we were all having as a group. And so there was this moment for me of like, wow, just like doing everyday things with people can really be a powerful way to like change communities. But I didn't necessarily see that in sort of the OT world. And so as I went through my program, I definitely was always asking those questions and sometimes pushing some professors, offering some critical perspectives. But at the same time, I was often being told, well, there aren't jobs out there. There isn't research that sort of describes this type of work that you're talking about. And that's actually ultimately what drove me to get a PhD, was because I wanted to do the research. I wanted to develop that type of approach to occupational therapy and be able to sort of explore and incubate this type of practice here in the United States. And so that's sort of what brought me as like sort of the faculty practitioner person that I am today within community practice.
I feel an affinity with you because I went to a liberal arts college that had such a focus on justice and community and thinking about things just from a global perspective, and went into OT because I suspected OT seems like a place that could be a home for all of these interests that I have. In our practice frameworks, community is called out explicitly, but my experience was so focused on the individual and on groups. Can you tell me a little bit more about how this understanding at the community level, what was there for you already? Having some framework, but not that much framework. What was that like?
There was this sense of being able to see context a little bit differently. And I think occupational therapy has done that. We've always been interested in that, even from our historical roots, like the Hull House and in Chicago, and thinking about building settlement houses as a community that shifts the norms of a space. So I think occupational therapy definitely still has that. And I came in interested in that and seeing that from coming from the liberal arts sort of university side of things, I found a lot of similar questions that had been asked in my theology and philosophy classes, matching up with those early roots of the questions that were spurring occupational therapy to begin being a thing in the early 1900s. And so I felt like there was a question there, but then as we further got into the curriculum and it sort of veered away from that much more into that biomedical and individualized model, I was like, wait, what happened? Where did we go? And then you look at the history and it's like, oh, the American Medical Association got real cozy with the occupational therapists. And we were like, oh, they have power. Let's go follow them. And so that then became sort of, again, a critical question that I can think about how our history really informs how the practice evolves. And I'll even say, like, we have historically understood, yes, individuals, but we also have been decent at contextualizing individuals, especially within occupational science. But I would say we more explicitly had that conversation after 2006, Dickey et al., transactional perspective sort of thing. But people were critically looking at individualism within occupational science. But what we didn't look at is sort of, we situated an individual in community, but we didn't look at the community as an organism, as a thing doing and being and within relationships of itself. And that's where I think we have to shift a little bit when we start thinking about actually applying those theoretical frameworks to real interventions or program development or jobs for occupational therapy practitioners in this realm. So I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but
yeah, that's really helpful to hear that. Like, I think you're putting words to, like, yes, I was also drawn to those early words or those early years of occupational therapy and the questions we were asking, and then found this such a focus on the biomedical model. But we're headed into this interesting time that I think, like, a lot of OTs came to the profession because we're interested in this holistic thinking. And I think how we're going to be thinking about community moving forward is really interesting and something we're primed for and something I think OTs will be excited about. Tell me about your work in the community practice lab.
Yeah. So one, I just want to follow up on the word holistic just before I jump in there, because I think it's a really interesting word that we've really honed in on and are always talking about in occupational, that we're holistic. And what I think when we unpack that, we're really thinking about the whole individual, right? We want to think about all the things that impact that individual. But if we were to expand holistic to everything around that individual, including other people, like, what does that holism look like? And I think that's what sort of community practice asks us, is to think of holism even more broadly than what we have historically understood holism to be, to sort of the whole community. And that's what the Community Practice Lab is really focused on, is really thinking through that framework and moving it forward. So when I was hired on as faculty at UNC Chapel Hill, I sort of proposed this idea of a space where, we as practitioners or the general public around us, the local communities, could have a foothold into the university where we could develop ideas based in occupation, but also informed by interdisciplinary approaches, to build programs and connections and job opportunities for people that were mobilizing this everyday life as the tool through which we created social change. And that was based off of 7 years of me being in the area, building community relationships. And so most of our work is focused in aging initiatives and housing initiatives, because that's where a lot of my work sort of put me as I was coming up in doctoral school. But our work tends to take that same occupational therapy process and apply it to different levels. So we do things like work with organizations to develop their neighborhood engagement plan. And a big focus of that is really thinking about, okay, how do you literally use everyday occupation to connect with community members, connect and build relationship with residents? What does that look like? You can't treat somebody that is in a resident of a local community where you're building houses like an office mate. That's just not how it goes. You have to go and do exercise with them. You have to show up at community events. You have to cook food and bring food with them to build that relationship. And so really honing in and focusing on that everyday doing implementation as part of sort of the ingredients that we bring to the table as a unique team, to support and consult with organizations and other program developments. Another aspect that's even a little bit broader is we actually coordinate a lot of coalition work or multi-sector sort of strategic planning. And so, for example, we coordinate a coalition of home repair organizations in the county. This was born out of our master aging plan, which we also coordinate. I'll talk about that in a second. But we essentially brought different home repair organizations together, and they needed to work better together. And so what I did was, I don't know anything about construction, but I do know how to grade activities and do activity analysis of how people are doing things together. And so I focused on how we could provide tools and grade activities up and down within that coalition so that they could actually work better together as a collective and share more information. And so when we develop a database, for example, for this coalition, we think about universal design, we think about accessible user interfaces so that those different organizations who might have different capacity to access information can still work together and share information across those different systems that they're working with so that people don't have to navigate that themselves and people aren't ping-ponging around to different home repairs just to get their air conditioning fixed in the summer. We actually do a lot of that work by making it an efficient information exchange between these organizations. So that's sort of some concrete examples. We also do that a little bit with like a county-wide master aging plan where we're coordinating and supporting our Department on Aging, which is a masterful coordinator of aging initiatives in our area, to help them sort of collect information and evaluate and think about next steps for moving aging initiatives forward in the county. So those are just a couple examples, but we do some other small partnerships with local communities, elder student partnerships where we think about intergenerational learning, having students and older adults doing things together through occupation and learning about ageism and housing and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's sort of what the community practice lab is meant to be. It's not meant to be an institute. It's not meant to be a research facility. It's really meant to be a space where faculty and community can build things together, rooted in this idea of everyday doing as a powerful tool.
It's so fascinating to me. Previously on the podcast, we had a guest that talked about social determinants of health. And she was doing a lot of, coalition stitching together pre-existing resources and doing that alongside hospital systems. As you look out across specifically community practice in the United States, is that what you see a lot of community practice OTs doing? Or what kind of roles do you see them in? Is it a lot of this, like, stitching things together, collaborating, or is it more varied than that?
I think it's both. I think that it's the community practitioners who are working in between organizations are, I think, easier to find because there's funding for that sort of work.
Yeah.
When you have multiple organizations needing to do something together, they can often pool funds to support a position or a consultant or that sort of thing. However, there are organizations like Department on Aging here in Orange County who the OT there runs a dementia, I don't know that she coordinates it anymore, but she did for a long time and sort of built it, the dementia-friendly business campaign. And so this one OT is going around training as many different businesses in the area who are interested in being dementia inclusive and teaching the frontline staff how to engage with caregivers. And that was her focus. Like that was a big portion of her job as in the Department on Aging. She also runs a durable medical equipment closet that is serving lots of different people, but is also coordinating actually receiving those and keeping track of them and creating data based on how many they need, doing fall prevention workshops at the local senior center and teaching group classes. And so that one I would say is a little closer to that individual sort of practice, but is also has the flexibility to step into these program development. And she shows up in policy meetings and talking about master aging plan processes and that sort of thing. But then you also have people like a previous podcast guest of yours, Adam Pearson, who is the director of human services in St. Louis. And so he is piecing together a lot of different departments and thinking through, health and well-being through a lot of different lenses and making sure resources are available to people, but also responding to the health needs of an entire city. And I would say, based on how much I've engaged with him, he does still think about it as an OT, and he really mobilizes his occupational therapy practice to do that job well. So maybe his title isn't occupational therapist in that moment, but still carrying forward those skills into that work, I think very much is possible. So I would say there's lots of different places in between those two. I've seen community practitioners in the US in women's shelters, working in real estate, doing home modification expertise and consultancy with both individual homeowners or like builders and developers. I've seen an OT as a national nonprofit evaluator. So she is head of all evaluation at this national nonprofit and really uses occupation as this focus for how she sees the benefits that the nonprofit is actually providing to the community that they're working within. So yeah, in the US, I think that there are out there. I think they're a little harder to find than maybe internationally.
I hear all those jobs and they sound so just fun, and I could totally see OTs thriving in them. Before we turn to this article, though, I want to ask about OTs who do work with just individuals, or I'm thinking like right now, I'm in rural Nebraska. I just don't see those job opportunities in my small town. Like, we don't have a big nonprofit. We don't like, you can work for our school or our hospital, and that's where our OTs work. I think all OTs probably need to be paying attention to this conversation. Why do you think it's important for OTs who work with individuals to also be thinking about community practice?
Yeah. Well, first, I want to just affirm that individual practice is still absolutely valuable and necessary. I'm not trying to erase individual practice from occupational therapy. I think that it's this other side of the coin, right? There's a lot of power and agency, and we talk a lot about social determinants of health, but there's also personal determinants of health, right? And the choices that we make and the skills that we have and the relationship that we have to those systems. And so we play a vital role in that individual level, ensuring people have the personal supports that they need to be able to manage those social determinants of health as best they can. But I think that that's why, though, when OTs are working in an individual setting and they continue to see the same type of diagnosis coming through, or they continue to see the same person coming back in again and again, readmission to hospital, falls again and again in the home. Those are the times when you have to ask a question of, are we reacting or are we responding? And this type of thinking in building a reaction or a response that addresses up the river, a little bit further, is really important for us to be thinking about when it comes to health and well-being. If we want to be holistic when it comes to communities, we can't just say, I'm going to help the person who walks through the clinic door and wait for that to happen. I think we have to recognize that health is much far beyond that. And that's why, as OTs, yes, the occupational justice perspective is helpful, but it's not just about understanding injustice. It's challenging your hospital to take accountability for the community in which it sits and say, hey, there are some preventative measures, there's some frameworks, there's some programs out there internationally or domestically that can actually contribute to preventative healthcare. OT in primary care, those sorts of things is even just a little step beyond the hospital sort of approach when it comes to these things.
Yeah, I just did a podcast on school-based OT and thinking about a school-wide program to really support kids with emotional disability. And as I look at that, I'm like, there's so much from community practice that I think these school-based OTs are borrowing. And how cool if they could like explicitly think about their work in schools as community practice. And I think we're going to see that happening in hospitals too, where there's going to be so many more community level initiatives, and hopefully funding towards value-based care really pushes us in that way. So I'm just so excited about that future where we're still working with individuals, but we do get to actively devote part of our time to thinking about the communities, because we see that works. And I think as OTs, we're really just excited and ready and prepared to step into those roles.
Yeah, I totally agree. And we'll also say, I think schools are are really on the way to being there because and they're less restricted by an individualized funding approach. To some extent, you have IEPs, right? But and they're individualized
Yeah.
education plans. But at the same time, we don't have that diagnosis-based, health insurance-based sort of funding model there to some extent. And so I think OTs are pushing that. We need to pay people in schools a lot more, and that might actually keep people around long enough to understand communities and build that community even more so than they already want to. But I do think schools have a lot of opportunity in this realm, and we see a lot of really great practitioners stepping up in schools to think broadly about how you can shift environment around students.
Turning to this article, I'm curious what your just initial takeaways were from reading it. For me, I just love the question of reimagining our clients as communities. And I like that back in 2019 that this was written. When I first read it, it felt problematic, like the focus just on the English-speaking countries and the Western countries. But then as you keep like the writings that have come out since have really, you've seen the evolution and the exciting conversations that are happening. So yeah, those were my like initial feelings about it. What were your takeaways from reading this article?
Yeah, I would agree. I had similar thoughts. I think I liked the title "Reimagining" and not just imagining because we are redoing something that we've already done to some extent. And going back to our roots, I often call community practice vintage OT rather than non-traditional OT because we're sort of the original traditional OTs in some ways, and so I really liked that aspect of it. I do think that in the original article in 2019, there was quite a focus on theoretical frameworks that had been developed in Western countries, English-speaking countries, and actually just very specifically within occupational therapy. And as much as there is mention of public health and other sorts of social work planning, those sorts of disciplines, I don't think that it didn't feel like it was engaged with as much. And I think that's a really important part of us stepping into this conversation because there are disciplines who have been studying community living for decades and have asked really hard questions about how to move and do research and engage within these spaces. And so to really go into this conversation with that literature in mind, I think is really important so that we're not reinventing public health and calling it occupational public health. I don't believe in that sort of approach. And so as we think about, I wish they had engaged with that question a little bit more interdisciplinarily. But I think that they ask a really good question of like, what frameworks do we have to really conceptualize communities? And I would even say, what sorts of frameworks do we have to conceptualize of community occupation? And that's where I think, again, it sort of focuses on the people and the clients, which is great and important. But a lot of people do that. And I think our superpower is focusing on that everyday doing and the occupation. And so I've always asked the question, how do we conceptualize the occupation of communities? And what does that mean? If we start thinking of it the same way as we do in clinical practice, we might begin to apply some of the similar tools. And so that was another thing I think in this article. Again, it doesn't necessarily focus so much on that occupation, and some of the programs they're not occupation based, and they weren't claiming to be, right? But there are public health programs and community programs out there that do really fantastic work and actually might even be better equipped than OTs are right now to do some of this work. And so I wish they had maybe tangled a little bit with that question originally. I think there has been subsequent publications by this author and other authors that have really tried to tangle with that and say, how do we describe occupation of a community? Does a community bike? Does a community swim? How do we name occupation when it's at that community level? How do we evaluate it when we have such a clear idea of that for individuals, but we don't necessarily have it at the community level?
So when you're describing community practice, how do you describe it to people? I think especially describing it to other laymen and not fellow like occupational scientists. And I guess my questions are how is it different than social work? How is it different than these other disciplines that also work with communities? And I'm curious if just the idea of community occupation resonates with people, or is that language that you steer away from? How are you describing it in your day-to-day?
Sure. Well, the first thing I'll say is I do not call it community service.
Yeah.
And I think just as a faculty member, I think that that's something we have to get away from in our curriculum is the community courses are often our community service courses. And that's really diminishing the power that we do have professionally in these spaces and thinking about how we can engage with them and get paid to do so and build really effective presence and businesses and consultations and that sort of thing. But I also think there's a difference. We have language of community practice, community-based practice, community-engaged practice. And I tend to lean towards community practice because I'm talking about that community level. Community-based could also be home health. It could be early intervention. It could be all the schools, where OTs are going into the context where people are living out their everyday lives to practice. And that's also an important way of doing it. So when I try and explain to people what my goals are, it's really about articulating that my goals are at the community level. The outcomes that I'm trying to measure and change are at the community level. I care about the individuals and I want them to have good health. But what I'm really focused on measuring and making sure we have significant change in is that community level shift, whether it's in norms or everyday doing or health outcomes. And that's where I see community practice actually being quite similar to social work, to public health. They're doing exactly the same thing. They want to see big number change across communities. I think the difference is, and it's funny because we have this same conversation with PT and with speech when there's so much overlap in certain places. And we have to find what makes us unique, which I also think is a little bit of like a competitive capitalism sort of approach to healthcare. But I think that there's value in recognizing that for me, we are so unique as a profession through our process, not necessarily the goal that we're always trying to get to. I have been known to critique the occupation as an ends justification for occupational therapy. I'm really interested in occupation as a means and as a lens, and I think that's what really helps us to see if we have to make a difference. We I think mobilize that everyday doing, the everyday implementation of practicing whatever work that group or people are doing in a different way than a PT would or a social worker would or a public healther would. Public healthers tend to come from a big structural perspective and tend to do a lot more of top-down interventions. Social workers, I would say, tend to focus on relationships and family dynamics and resource navigation a lot more than we do in some instances. But again, there's a lot of overlap across these, and I think there's enough work for us all to do it, and we can all bring our different skills. For OTs, even in the work that we do, thinking about how someone accesses a database, we go in and my team, they're made of planners, and I've got some policy students and geographer on my team. They've gotten used to me going in and saying, tell me about your routine of how you use this information. Like, what is it that would be helpful to you in our monthly meetings for you to communicate with these other organizations? Tell me how you as a nonprofit have historically routinely been in community with the residents where you're building houses. Those sorts of questions are very occupational questions. And I don't hear social workers ask those sorts of questions as much, or public healthers. And I think that there's something there. People have responded well to me sort of taking the time, slowing down the pace and saying, okay, yes, I hear that you want to implement this new intervention, but like, what does that look like to actually do in the everyday? So I tend to use language like everyday doing, community doing. Every once in a while, it's a joke. I'll sort of whisper and be like, this is occupation, you know, because everyone's like, you're an occupational therapist. What are you doing here? And I'm like, this is occupation, but I don't tend to, because I believe in speaking the language that the people understand. And so if I am speaking to occupational therapists, I use that language. If I'm not, then I will let them know that there is a word for this that I use professionally. But I'll use the language that most resonates with them, if that's health or, everyday doing or everyday life. That's the way I go.
What would you say I've heard you use the phrase like magic tools that we bring to our intervention with communities? Are they kind of the same as what we're using with individuals? Is it a distinct skill set? Like, how do you think about, I guess, our intervention, which doesn't feel like the perfect word, but that part of our process?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think a lot of people look at community practice and get really scared because they're like, I don't know how to do this type of practice. I don't know what an OT is here. And I often have to pause people and say, tell me, what are your skills as an occupational therapist? And they list off things like activity analysis, grading and tailoring activities, accessibility focus, care planning, evaluation, and I then say, okay, well, let's think about what we do in community. So for example, as we were partnering with a nonprofit, we spent the first 3 months talking with local residents and hearing oral histories about their everyday lives in the community, hearing what was hard, what was challenging, what was their experience with this nonprofit in the past, what would they like to see differently. We essentially did an occupational profile of a community through oral histories. And that's exactly the types of questions that you probably want to be asking in the clinic or when you're with somebody in the school. It's just with a whole community, it takes a little bit longer, but it's still the same questions. And then we think, okay, what are the different tools or modifications to activities that we might be able to bring in? And what activities can we actually build off of? So, for example, in one community where we work, they have a long history of porch parties as like a thing where a neighbor says, I'm throwing a porch party. Sometimes it's around a specific holiday. Sometimes it's actually there's something going on in the community and we need to organize. So I'm going to throw a porch party and talk about this social host ordinance that's being passed and that we should support it. And so we learn about those occupations, those community doings that are facilitating progress and social change or organizing. And then we build off of those. And so we say, this community is really interested. There's a lot more Spanish speakers moving in. So how do we actually modify porch parties to be inclusive of Spanish speakers in this community? Is there assistive technology that we can use? Are there, different relationships that we could build so that there's a community of care, within the community to incorporate this inclusivity of Spanish speakers? And so I think that's the value that we bring as occupational therapists, is that analytical lens to really look at what the everyday is for people and then see if we can tinker and see if we can shift and move the tools and things that we have. But I think it takes a different knowledge base. You're not necessarily managing biomedical systems. You're managing economic systems or housing systems or street planning, to build accessibility. So I think that that's what we have to learn, is that you already have the tool belt. You might just need to learn exactly where you are and when you're using it and what the different knowledges are that you need to use with those tools. And that's where we can sort of probably do a little bit better work in our education or specialization opportunities for community practice.
It's so interesting to me because this feels like such a distinct area of practice, but I'm just hearing the themes that I hear across totally different practice areas of just sounds like getting deeply curious about who you're working with, finding out those strengths, building on those strengths, thinking about those routines and habits. And that looks different no matter who you're working with, but it sounds like this same core skill set that OTs love getting to lean into I know we've been immersed in this biomedical model, but we just love getting to think a little more broadly. And I feel like more and more opportunities are coming for us to do that. I'm curious, as you look out across the landscape, do you see more opportunities coming for OTs in this area? Like what are the future jobs that we're going to have in community practice? I think this article like rightly identified like there does just seem to be this enthusiasm around the community level. Yeah, do you agree with that? And what do you see and what's our specific place in that?
Yeah, I want to touch on something you said just briefly in thinking about that. We love the biomedical model, but we also have to look at that history, right? And think about the power that came with the biomedical model. And that maybe we love it so much because it gives us so much power and the sort of scienciness, of it. And the recognizing there's different sciences out there and there's different knowledge bases. And this is just a different one that maybe hasn't been valued as much by society that we're asking people to step into. And so the places where I think we're starting to realize that other knowledge can be really helpful are the places where I think these jobs can really come in and really build the opportunity for preventative care and just more inclusive communities. So thinking about community mobility as a consulting sort of space, I think is huge. Driving, working with planners to think about mobile communities. This new generation is wanting walkability across their cities. How do we do that? That's our bread and butter. Thinking about accessible access for cities, transportation, and how we can really build friendly age-friendly, disability-friendly spaces. I think there's roles for us. There's huge, very expensive consultant organizations that are providing that sort of engagement with local governments and that sort of thing. I think real estate is sort of the similar. You can put a flavor on real estate to think about how we can help you find accessible homes. I know also internationally that museums have started hiring OTs in full-time positions just to be sort of the accessibility coordinator. And so we've worked with our university museum a lot because they see the value. And so there's actually some interest in sort of like, how do we get a consultant in-house instead of having to rely on these other organizations? And I think generally just thinking about program evaluation. So like I mentioned, that if we can show the value that we put on human doing, that holistic community approach, and know the skills and tools to actually evaluate that, people love that story and they value the ability to tell that story through everyday doing and what it means for somebody to have an intervention done, but then their everyday life is changed. And it's not just about the numbers anymore and the quantitative, but it's also about the occupational. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to lean into that. Also, with new boomers coming up, we've got a lot of aging stuff going on. So I think there's lots of opportunities for departments on aging, councils on aging, area agencies on aging, the Administration for Community Living, putting out grants and those sorts of things. I think that's a huge area where I see future jobs for us as consultants and even program developers. And then finally, I would say technology, design and developers. So website design, user interface design, new assistive technology, just AI, and how to rope that in a way that's both ethical and accessible. I think if we are willing to recognize the value and core sort of inherent process of occupational therapy and be willing to let go of like the teat of healthcare a little bit, we have a lot of opportunities to really lean into that process, applying it to new and interesting spaces. But we have to be good at talking about the process, not just, I get you back to using the bathroom. That's super important. But a PT could probably say the same thing, right? And so really talking about that process and owning our means as a profession, I think can really help us then expand into these other spaces and places, even if it's not individual based or community based.
I hear these jobs that you're saying, and I'm like, oh, I just know the hunger in OTs to step into these kind of exciting roles. I think the final just big question I want to ask is like, how do we get ready for these jobs that I absolutely believe are coming and like OT has a role in? And I guess two-part question, like what should I do as an individual to get ready for this new future that has more of a community practice lens? Like I'm already through school. I'm already like, what can I do now as someone who's working? And then just like big picture as a profession, how do we need to be shifting towards this world where we're, I guess, again, reimagining our clients as communities and going back to some of these roots?
Yeah, so I think getting ready, I would encourage you to play. It's one of the most valuable occupations, right? And we forget to play. And the system pushes us into productivity land and really think about imagining, imagining communities of care and how we can step into those conversations in real and practical ways, like in your hospital, going to your population health department and saying, hey, I've heard that community OTs are really making a difference in this way. Would you all be willing to play with some ideas? We don't have to fund it, but like, can we sit down for 3 hours and just like throw some ideas around? And not everybody has time for that. And that's a privileged place to be to some extent. But I think also thinking entrepreneurially, if that's a word, um, really thinking about how we can play with ideas, sit between organizations as a consultant, but also be willing to be bold and make requests for grants or apply to community foundations that are interested in moving things forward and take a chance. We have a really cool community paramedic program in our area that really started as just like one manager was like, I need to give you like a day, like a week to maybe try this. And it ended up working really well. And there wasn't real funding for it at first. But then when they did actually see how effective it was, they were able to get more funding and justify more. So it is a little bit of a starting out process, but allowing ourselves to play with those ideas and imagine how you could be an OT in these other places and not sort of in the box of what we've been told OT has to be in this country, I think is the first step. On the other side, not to be political, but to be political, I think you should vote. Mm-hmm. I think when we think about the health system and preventative care and the types of approaches that do actually prevent readmission that increase health, socialized medicine is doing that in a lot of ways, and people have a lot more access to that, and the people who work in those systems often have more flexibility to think more at that community level than having to tie their interventions to a single person, and really think about community outcomes. So I think as a profession, we should be arguing and pushing for political and policy decisions that will allow more people to receive accessible healthcare, and accessible support, whether that's for health or not, for everyday doing, right, in schools or in other places. I think AOTA needs to also push for a reimagining of what OT can really be and open up spaces that are taken seriously, to really think about what that could mean for the profession in the future and open up more of a job market as well, because we now have a ton of new graduates. And I think they're finding it more difficult to find a job in some instances. But, where can we really build more and think about the places that they can go, other than sort of the typical OT places that some people still need to go.
And it seems like part of what I imagine would be really fun about community practice is the OTs in community practice really do value community. And I see this in this paper where there is this international conversation going on that you could get to be a part of. And there's just so much fodder to be thinking about. Like you get to see what's happening in different countries and so much fodder for the imagination there. And it just feels like an area that, I don't know, feels fun, I guess, to be connected in so many interesting conversations there.
Yeah, there's so many people doing really cool things in the U.S. as well as international. I mean, resettlement after conflict, refugee support. There's just a lot of different ways that occupational therapy and occupational, or not even the word occupation, but everyday doing, or cotidiano, as they say in Brazil, quotidian life. That is the ways that they have built knowledge that moves community practice forward, or social transformation, or social occupational therapy, which is another framework that's really out of Brazil. And you get to really play again with different ideas, different cultures. And often, though, you will have hard conversations about colonization, about racism, about economic exploitation, about war and conflict. But at the same time, you will meet fantastic practitioners who are really thinking about rich engagement with communities and occupation as a tool, and what beautiful things can come from that combination.
This has been just, I guess, such a joy to be able to spend this time to look at community practice, coming in feeling like it was I guess nebulous, something that I couldn't really pinpoint. And now, after spending time in conversation with this paper, I guess I'm seeing it like everywhere and undergirding a lot of what we're doing, and a lot of future potential for both people to explicitly have those jobs, but also for it to infuse all the work that we're doing as OTs. Yeah, it's just been, I guess just a joy to peek into this conversation and to understand it better. We've touched on lots of different things in this conversation today. What's the thought that you want to leave us on?
It'll be layered, but I think I want to start with a thought of gratitude for you, actually, for one, having this conversation and opening up the space. But in many ways, I think through OT Potential, the podcast, even over Instagram, we are doing community practice. We are educating, we're building relationships, we're changing, the conversation when it comes to how we as a community work together as a profession. And I think we're being OTs. We're trying to make information accessible through these sorts of things. And so I'm grateful for other practitioners like you and other Instagrammers and other podcasters who are really building community in a way that helps us learn and grow together, that inspires us to allow occupational therapy to be everything that we really want and hope it really can be for our communities. But I would say that's my note, is be grateful and be excited for the skills that you really do have as a practitioner that you can bring to a lot of different problems, and just give yourself the chance to play and explore and talk with your community members and residents and build relationships that can lead you to say, oh, well, this is what I've been doing. It's just in a different space. And just opening yourself up to that, I think, is a really exciting process. Sometimes a little scary, but that's why we have community. Yeah.
Oh, well, Ryan, thank you so much for this time today. I love the push to play. I love just the call out of the importance of community, and that we get to do that in our practice, and that we also get to be a part of an occupational therapy community and experience it at so many levels. And it was just a joy to talk about today.
Well, thank you. And it was so wonderful to have a good community-based conversation.
Thank you. Wow, you all, this community practice movement feels so important for our profession, from both a theory perspective related to how we understand OT and our role in health, but also as a frontier for job creation. There is so much to talk about in response to this conversation, and I really want to hear what your thoughts are. If you are a casual listener to this podcast, we would love a review from you. You can now review us on Google from our homepage, or we always appreciate your comments on our YouTube video. But the best place to really discuss the implications of all of this is in the OT Potential Club, and I will be watching for your comments in our forum. The OT Potential Club is also where you will go to earn a CEU certificate for your time today. So what you are going to do next is head to OT Potential and either sign in or sign up for the OT Potential Club. Once you are in there, you can take a 5-question test. And when you pass, we will generate a certificate for your time today. Okay, I just want to thank you so much for joining us. I hope this podcast helps keep you informed and inspired as an OT professional. Take care, and we'll talk next time.